everyone. My name is Debbie Fox, and I'm with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and I'm a part of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium with Collaborative Solutions, the National Alliance for Safe Housing, and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our Comparable Database webinar series here today on July 8, 2018, with Collaborative Solutions and NNEDV from the consortium. We'll be highlighting the best practices happening at the Iowa Coalition Against Domestic Violence. On today's webinar, you'll be hearing from Zeb Bielke-McCallum and Scott Bauer from the Iowa Coalition, and Laura Schott from Collaborative Solutions, and myself. We will be fielding questions in the chat box during the webinar. The goal of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium coordinated comparable database series is to highlight what bubbles up from the field and to let you know what we are hearing that works and to share that with you all. There is no one-size-fits-all perfect comparable database solution, and we encourage you to take the ideas shared here today to inspire you and to keep you moving forward with creating or improving comparable databases and data collection procedures in your community and state. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Scott and Zeb from the Iowa Coalition to begin today's comparable database webinar. Go ahead, Scott and Zeb. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. This is Scott Bauer. I'm here with Zeb. Thanks for having us today. I'm going to start by kind of briefly, relatively briefly, give you a history lesson of where we were coming from, which might be very comparable to some of you out there, and show you where we made some mistakes, and then where we're at today with a fully functional, working, solid database. As was mentioned already, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat, and we'll answer them as we can. So I'll start out, and then Zeb will finish up. There's our contact info. If you have any questions for us outside of this webinar, feel free. That's kind of what we do, is we help people out, not only here in Iowa, but across the country. It's a fairly complicated thing to go through, and we'd like to share our experiences and what we've done and why. A few slides of the consortium, who were here. Let me get to Debbie. You can go back over these if you like.
Sure, yeah. So as I said in the introduction, we're part of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. So we work in partnership with a few other national organization TA providers, and one of them is a HUD TA provider that's on the webinar today with us, Collaborative Solutions. And the work that we do is led and funded by 4 federal agencies: the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program, the Office on Violence Against Women, the Office for Victims of Crime at VOCA, and then the SNAP's office, the Office of Special Needs at HUD. And so some of the work that we are doing is being able to provide webinars like this to you all today, and materials and policy briefs that are related to the issues that are impacting the field. And I'm sure a lot of you have visited our website at safehousingpartnerships.org, but that's where a lot of our research and building the case for the intersection around DV and housing and homelessness work that we do. And there's a lot of information around building the evidence base and what works in research best practices for our field. And that's a little graphic of the Safe Housing Partnerships website, where you can see some of the headings for that. Next slide. I'm going to turn it back over to Iowa.
All right.
Go ahead, Scott. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Debbie. I just wanted to give proper credence to those slides gone by that I didn't have full knowledge of. All right, the history lesson for Iowa. where we were as far as the database. We were kind of in the Stone Ages, if you will. And frankly, up until this last and current database that we're using, a lot of our places, a lot of our local agencies were. You got about 25, 28, depending on how you count them, local agencies that were using a wide variety of mechanisms to record what they do on a daily basis, be it paper, be it Excel, you know, in-house Excel forms that they've made themselves. They did this for many, many years. About 5 years ago or so, there was a push to get something more modern, more standardized, if you will. And they went with a DBI-SAM database, very much like a standalone Excel, or excuse me, Access database that was used across the board by many places, many of our local agencies. And that worked for a while until reports started coming. They'd run a report and then run it again, and they get two different sets of numbers. Things like that happened. And it was also very cumbersome, a system that they were using, a lot of duplication of effort to get into what was being used and what's not. So the whole point was to get something quickly, well, primarily quickly, that the advocates could put information in and get back to their real jobs, if you will. That's kind of a focus we had here in Iowa, was to make this as easy as we could for the end users. If a system's not easy enough for people to use without it being a major headache, they're more apt to use it. And good data in, good data out. So, path we took. This was a lead, if you will, or came out of our state AG's office who funded this. We, as a coalition here, in our sister coalition, Iowa CASA, worked together with the state to provide some guidance on here. We worked with NNEDV, Confidentiality Institute, handful, if not more than a couple handfuls of our local agencies. I remember distinctly that one of the first sit-down meetings we had was about 30 people sitting around the table. That's too many cooks in the kitchen for this, we come to find out. But it was needed in the long run, get everybody's insight on what we did. So, in essence, state issued an RFP of what this database should look like for the entire local agencies and the coalitions. My role, I kind of have a unique role from what I've been told, or DV across the country, is I'm hired on just to do IT. I do a handful of other things too, but that's my job. I think they brought me in, I got, what am I at, 27 years IT experience from all across avenues. So they brought me in as kind of to help out and push this along a little bit, I believe. We started out with that RFP went out, this was 4 years ago or so, and they chose a database that was a case management database. It's a good database, and it took about 12 to 14 months to actually get it developed, and that had partially to do with the vendor, partially to do with our internal haranguing, if you will, of what should be in this and what shouldn't. There was a good amount of time involved by everybody in this. Again, I'm taking 5 years and boiling it down to about 20 minutes here, but it ended up that we rolled out this database, and we were halfway through training the advocates across the state, and there were security problems that reached the Bokovawa confidentiality requirements. I'll talk about that in a minute, but so we shut that that database down, gave the vendor a chance to remedy it, and the vendor could not. So that contract was canceled. So all that time was out the window for the most part. We rewrote the RFP to better specify the security requirements we needed, because this thing doesn't, well, I'm from the South, so I have an old saying that cake is no good, doesn't matter how much frosting you put on it. The cake was bad. The security is the critical point of any database when it comes down to VOCA VAWA. Again, I've been doing this for decades. I've worked for government agencies and what have you, banks, protected financial information, federal information, what have you. When I come to work here at the Coalition, I'm protecting something that's a lot more valuable. And this is something I've learned over the last few years with this, is we're actually protecting survivor information. Now, if I would have lost, as an IT guy, if I would have lost banking information, financial credit card numbers, what have you, some people would be inconvenienced, some people might lose some money. But if I lose survivor information, I don't do everything I can to protect that, and I lose some, and that gets into the wrong hands, very bad things could happen to our survivors. So my best interpretation of VOCA VAWA for this, and again, talking with people with a bigger brain than I on this, I kind of boil it down to that we have to do everything in our power to protect this information, our survivors' information. And frankly, this first database we used wasn't good enough. We could do better. And that's kind of the path that we took after this when we rewrote this RFP. We went through the whole RFP process a second time. The vendor was chose. Contract negotiations with them lasted about a year until it was finally determined that the vendor could not meet our security requirements yet again. So that vendor was dismissed and we went with another vendor. Who frankly was my vendor of choice from the get-go, but that's neither here nor there. There was a fundamental change in this last year, if you will, after this vendor was in negotiations, the fundamental change of our thought process with this. We were looking to get-go for a case management software, case management database. Our current vendor might disagree with me, but that's not what we got, and that's not what we needed. We needed a reporting database. We want to put information in the system and get a report out. That's it. That's our primary criteria. Now, having the flexibility to add in all the bells and whistles, or that frosting, if you want to call it, for a database to do case management stuff, that's great. But at the core of this whole thing, where we're at now and what's been so successful for us this time, is that we focused on getting the reports. Just enough information is put in the system to get the reports out in an accurate and easy manner, if you will. Challenges along the way. I mentioned some of these already, but VOCA VAWA FIPS, the client survivor confidentiality. And that's what you click and what the icons on the screen look like and what text you can enter here and there and how you can keep track of people. That's great. That's all wonderful and good stuff, as long as the security is there. And like I mentioned, our first two vendors that we had did encryption and this, that, and the other, and touted that they could do everything under the sun. When push came to shove, they're business databases. They're made for banks. They're made for healthcare. They're framed in that way. And those, as a business, you love sharing information to your branches. You love sharing information around to help with your business model, and that's great. You don't run a business model. You run survivors here, survivor information. So the kicker of this whole thing, the key, if you will, the one thing to take from today, from my viewpoint, is zero knowledge encryption. Without that, your database, in my opinion, does not meet the VOCA VAWA standards. You have to be able to keep a vendor from seeing the information. When I say vendor, I mean not only the person or company making the database, but also where that database is stored. I'm talking about internet-based, cloud-based databases. You can have an agreement between you and the vendor and Google or Microsoft or whoever that nobody at the vendor will look at the data. Well, that's fine. And if we have any lawyers on here, forgive me, but everything written can be argued. And I would rather not give the keys to my house to somebody, make sure my house is secure. You know, I'd rather just not give them the keys to it. That's what zero-knowledge encryption allows us to do. In a nutshell, I can go down and get in the weeds with that, but that's the critical bit. Looking at one question here, clarify why zero-knowledge encryption is necessary for de-identified data. Information in our database is not de-identified. There's still information in there that our advocates use to actually do their job. First name, last name, home, contact information. We don't do social security numbers. Other information. Iowa's a rural state, and this example has been given. We got 3 million people in the whole state of Iowa. We have some counties that have about 10,000 people or less. They're even de-identified information. If I put a race to somebody, for example, a county, and say they're in a certain county, I can still find them. Okay? Bigger states might have an easier job with that. Kind of really want to make this as anything that gets put in this database is secure from everybody except who holds the keys. In our case, the only people that hold the keys to the encryption for the database are the local agencies. Us at the coalition don't have access, the vendor does not have access, the state does not have access, and none of the other local agencies have access. Only a handful of people, usually 2, at a local agency have the actual keys. RFP was for, the state issued that out to any vendor who thought they could do the job. All right. On the screen here is your PII definition. Hopefully most of you know that by now or know what's in there. To me, it kind of goes beyond that too. It's, again, anything that could possibly be used to identify somebody. All right. Now here's some stats on what PII actually means and what it actually can boil down to. Yeah, there's 25 counties, population under 10,000. We got 99 counties, so it's a sizable chunk. What's necessary for zero encryption and what's preferred. And this all comes down to my interpretation of the voca VAWA does not necessarily or explicitly state anything about encryption or zero knowledge encryption. This is an interpretation done by us, if you will, as to what's good enough. What's our best effort? And then we took it a step further, what we could do better. That helps with that. A little awkward. I'm used to talking to big rooms full of people, so I'm talking to myself. I mentioned this before. What are we actually protecting? This is what we're protecting. It's not only is the survivor, the family, abuse, any information related to this, what type of services these folks received. Just writing it down technically is a liability. So having it recorded into a cloud-based, internet-based, highly dispersed database, again, that's why we need this under as few eyes as possible. And frankly, that's the critical bit for this whole thing from our standpoint here, from my standpoint at least, is most of these other databases that are out there, they're great. They can do the job absolutely fine. Whether they're comparable or not doesn't really matter. That's frosting. It's whether or not that data, when it's at rest, when it's in transit, whatever you want to call it, nobody can ever see that. That's the key for us. All right. Solution, talked about this. Keeping the ownership of the data entirely with the local agency. Bubble idea, we call it. This is to keep everything that's possibly usable under that one bubble, that bubble being a local agency. I don't care if they're a local agency of 100 advocates or a local agency of 5. They're handled exactly the same here. Now our system does, the language is a little different here. We call it programs, but we are DV, SA, homicide, shelter, and then we have some other programs that are what we call new initiatives, which are programs that are newly funded, kind of fall into a bunch of everything, culturally specifics. It does the reporting for all these. So having that information from all these different categories in the same database, the same place, last thing we want to do is to have this out in the open. So where are we at now? The completed database, it's fully compliant, Vocavala, FIPSA standards and requirements. Again, that is to the best of our interpretation of those things. Training has been completed to almost all the advocates in the state. That number now, today, is probably closer to 250 plus. I'll talk about support model here in a second. The site administrators at each local agency have been trained in methods of not only running reports, but also tweaking the database and maintaining it internally themselves. That was key. You can hire up a database vendor and bring them in. They can make the database, and that's fine. That's half the work. The support model for this type of security is unique. I've never seen it in any place that I've ever done work for. Normally, in the model that we had for previous databases was basically a hierarchical model where I, as the IT guy, was like a super admin. I could have my fingers in any of the bubbles out there and help out and do administration. Well, that's not the case for this. Because the keys and the security is local agency specific, they have to have people at their local agency who can be the admin. Now, that kind of put me out of a job in a way, but it's what was needed to match the security. My role now, and what I would recommend, is you have people at the coalition level. I have a counterpart, Kelsey Roby, over at Iowa CASA on our SA side of our sister coalition, who does the same kind of work, is we help out these local site admins to the best of our ability. We did the training. We provide constant technical assistance to them, fielding questions. Our coalition databases look a lot like local agencies' databases, so we can walk through some things. And then we have direct access to the vendor. So any questions that we can't answer, we can go that way. Having the support model is almost as important in the long run as security, and I really feel that. You can have the best thing ever, but if there's not going to be any support for it or very expensive support for it, you're not going to end up using it for very long. So it's a investment, if you will, in, we have about 60 site admins throughout the state of Iowa who manage their own bubbles, who talk to each other, who talk to me, talk to Kelsey at Iowa CASA, on how to do this stuff, how to put in the information that they need, how to get the reports out. So that's very important. That support model is definitely something that needs to be thought of prior to or during the time when you're actually considering a database vendor. Because again, half the work's done by them, by the vendor, half the work is going to be done by you guys or whoever is working with the vendor. Depending on your vendor, they may not know exactly what kind of reports you need. They may know the big ones, the HUD reports, the vocal vowel reports, SIPSA, what have you. But in our case, ours was state funded, so there's many state reports that need to be included in the system. Having the ability for a local agency to be able to run their own reports is very critical. So, last thing I have on here is this went mandatory. It's been live for several months, and our advocates have been trained on it. It's been mandatory to be used per the state funder as of July 1. So everybody's using this now. This system has replaced other systems that were in place. Again, that old standalone database, Excel, several other databases that people have been using just to get by. This has replaced a lot of those. It is possible. It does take some work and some forethought. But again, your cake is good if your fundamental, your foundation is solid with your security. The rest of it is frosting. You can make it look any way you want. I'm going to turn it over to Zeb.
Great. Thanks, Scott. I really want folks to feel empowered about taking on this conversation about getting a database that works for everyone. And I've been working at this intersection of homelessness and domestic violence for a long time now, and trying to mesh together two systems that are not used to being meshed together is a challenge, but it is a worthy challenge, and the outcome is a worthy outcome, and it is possible. So please, particularly if you're feeling discouraged about how all of these databases, just sort of listening to Scott's story, we found a lot of ways that did not work before we found a way to work. And as Debbie said at the beginning, no size fits all, and this is a database that meets our needs, that does the things that we needed to do. So I want to tell you a little bit about Iowa and about what we think is going to work for us and how it interacts with HUD and homelessness. So in Iowa, this is our lovely map of Iowa. We have 4 continuums of care, 2 of which actually cross state lines into Nebraska. We have basically 1 urban COC and a balance of state COC. So there are a lot of distinct, unique challenges in each of our COCs, and then for the victim service programs to interact with the COCs in Sioux City, in our balance of state, in Des Moines, and in Omaha is always a challenge of trying to make these systems talk well together, and it has been an ongoing challenge with lots of partners engaged in lots of emails and face-to-face meetings and conversations as we work this out. So this is Iowa's victim service map. I was divided into 6 regions. There are 25 domestic violence service providers across the state of Iowa in our 99 counties. As Scott said, 6 of those 25 are culturally specific programs, and 7 of those providers are traditional shelters. So the vast majority of our projects are not shelters, but they do a great deal of housing. A lot of it is transitional housing or rapid rehousing, and frequently in many regions of our state, they are the only service providers that are doing any sorts of housing homelessness work. trying to develop a coordinated entry system on top of a wide and varied COC system with a variety of needs is our ongoing work in progress, and this is our current attempt at coordinated entry and the coordinated entry regions that are being sorted through. So you notice all the programs in the state have their 99 counties, their 6 service regions, their 4 COCs, and then on top of that, their coordinated service entry regions as well, that many of which are being championed or headed by domestic violence service providers because they are the only service provider that falls into that region, and because the folks on the ground, the folks experiencing homelessness and the folks experiencing domestic violence desperately need those services. But this is a lot of complication that happens very quickly, and if you don't have a database that's working the way it's supposed to, you can get into trouble very quickly. So it was essential for our successes and goals of ending homelessness that we had domestic violence programs and HUD programs that were able to work together. And we have worked together and been very successful in our work together. So in Iowa, looking at our ESG awards, 36% of all the ESG funding that comes into the state of Iowa goes to domestic violence programs. These are 9 projects. I believe all except for one of those is a rapid rehousing project. And then 17% of our continuum of care funds also go to victim service projects currently. 6 of those are in the balance of state. There's 1 in Sioux City, and there are none in Des Moines right now, but we are very hopeful with the some of the new continuum of care funding streams and focus on domestic violence rapid rehousing that we can get a project in Des Moines as well, because it's desperately needed. I will say that these percentages actually used to be higher with the move away from transitional housing. Some of our programs really experience challenges, not due to the core of their work, but just to the outcomes that just to the way and the struggles that Scott talked about with database reporting. They were struggling to compete. Though there has been a shift towards rapid rehousing, which has been so exciting for our domestic violence programs as well. Real quick, just these are our last hit totals from 2018. We had 2,749 total homelessness folks experiencing homeless in Iowa. Vast majority of those either in emergency shelter or transitional housing. Though on a positive note, we also had a lot of folks in permanent housing, nearly evenly split between permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, which is a testament to the work that we are doing in Iowa on our homeless projects. And I just really wanted to give you a flavor of what our state is like and why the database that we chose and that we're talking about works for us, and it may work other places too, as we hope. And we've been doing this, training on this and working through this process for a few years, but the database has only been live in functioning for a matter of weeks. And programs are currently going through that transitioning their HUD grants to this new database. So, and therein lies the problem. We have domestic violence programs, some of which service regions are more than 20 counties. Now, counties in Iowa are a little different than some places. We have 99 counties in Iowa because the county was defined as a distance that you could get to the county seat in a horse and buggy in one day. That's how Iowa determined their counties, so that's why we have 99 of them. And we have multiple counties that actually have under 4,000 people in a single county. And as Scott said, 25 counties in the state have less than 10,000 people. So that's really situations where everybody knows everybody and everybody's in everybody's business. And for safety, it is essential for DV programs to protect confidentiality and to be able to manage and successfully do their reporting. And domestic violence programs, sexual assault, trafficking programs were losing out in competitive applications because they were struggling to collect and report data correctly. The reports, sometimes even if they would do the report correctly, it just looked very different from what was being produced by the HMIS lead. And as folks who've been engaged in the CoC process know, or the ESG process, the various grantees, everyone's grant evaluators are trying to do a good job, but it doesn't always look the same. And so for domestic violence programs to be competitive, they needed a database that could generate an ESG caper and a accurate CoC APR. And that this was vital. That would meet HUD's requirements and protect confidentiality in a genuine, real way that didn't just play lip service to confidentiality, but would work in a county of 4,000 people where the domestic violence program is the only service provider, in that information wouldn't be shared outside of the domestic violence program. We're very lucky in Iowa because we have a Supreme Court ruling that recognizes advocate confidentiality sort of on the similar terms as attorney-client privilege when it comes to information. And it's vital for our advocates in order to preserve that Supreme Court advocate confidentiality ruling, that they aren't providing personally identifying information to outside groups or outside agencies. So we needed a database that could do that. And we tried, and we tried, and we tried, and we tried various false solutions that didn't work, including limiting the collection of some personally identifying information, such as birthdays, social security numbers, limiting the collection of names, not entering those things into the database. We tried creating a non-HMIS database with assistance from the HMIS lead, which we thought would work until it became clear that the HMIS lead had access to all of the personally identifying information in the database. That, again, promises of confidentiality, promises of protecting these things didn't work or pan out. And that, I don't think that arises out of malintent by anyone, but there is just a lot of misinformation and a lack of understanding and hurt feelings about the basic requirements of HUD and of the victim services programs. And so for us, the solution that worked for us was the Empowered DB database, specifically because it preserved information at the local level with our local programs that protected that advocate confidentiality, had the ability to generate all of our VOCA, VAWA, FIPSA, other state domestic violence reports, and had the ability to generate a HUD CAPER and HUD APR report. And that the personal identifying information was kept within the program and is actually stored in Iowa, so that there is no question that Iowa law, Iowa confidentiality applies to any of the information that we put into the database. So I think that's very important for us, and because a lot of our advocates are not based in a shelter, are not based in a program, they need easy access to the data entry anywhere. And so that was also essential for us in moving forward with what we chose in a database and how it was the only option that would provide a solution that protected confidentiality and allow us to generate the reports. It took a long time to get to this point. We had many meetings with key stakeholders, including meeting with the HMIS lead, including meeting with the ESG state lead. Scott and I were involved. Our boss was involved. Lots of bosses were involved. Our Attorney General's office, who is our VAWA administrator, those are the ones that eventually ended up issuing the RFP for this database, were involved, and the local programs were involved, making sure that they understood what was being asked of them. I would say now, if we were to do this over again, also on their any coordinated entry folks also should be involved. We didn't necessarily have that in our meetings, but that would be essential now, is to be engaging with the coordinated entry system as well. And just we had to work through those lack of understandings about definitions, definitions of confidentiality, definitions related to encryption, definition of release, that these things are really very, very important, and not everybody comes to the table with the same understanding of these things. And actually, just dealing with a lot of history. I think it's fair to say in Iowa, at various points in time, the relationship between our state coalition and our HMIS administrator has been contentious. That there is a history of contention between those, and we needed to work through those things and come to a place of honesty and trust, and that just took time to get everybody on board with understanding why DV programs are so vested in protecting personal identifying information, and also understanding why HUD and folks responsible for producing their CoC and ESG reports are so vested in those reports being accurate and conveying as much information as possible. Was just very important and cannot be done in a single meeting. So that's the place where we are at now, of transferring from various databases to this single web-based zero encryption. Scott has taught me what zero encryption means. Zero knowledge encryption database that gets us to a place where it's possible for our programs to report accurately and do the work that they need to do. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm sure Scott and I would love to answer some questions, or Debbie or anyone else has other things to chime in on.
Hi, Deb and Scott. We just got a question in the chat box about upfront cost as well as continuous monthly and or annual fees.
Considering how this was paid for through us, I don't think I'm in a place I can say.
Okay.
It's not pocket change, but it's not a selling the farm thing. So somewhere in between.
Okay. Yeah, she said she understood that it would vary by different programs in different states.
If I bought it, I'd be more than happy with it.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, if I bought the thing, I'd be more than happy to tell you how much it costs.
Tina also asked, what type and level of support does Empower provide?
That may vary. I do know there's an annual fee. And I guess it's like updated reports. You know, like I think DVHTAC just was updated this week. It's already done, I believe. So it gets our major reports and pre-canned reports updated, and it gets us access to the vendor for major issues.
Lance asked if you could talk a little bit more about why you would not consider Empower to be a case management database. What's it lacking?
That's a fair question. That's my own words, if you will. It very well could be classified as case management. To me, given the other databases that we've had on the hook, if you will, before, there's more functionality here as opposed to a lot of extra bells and whistles. I don't mean to downplay that. The extra bells and whistles are easily add back on, but what we were looking for and what we got was a straight, what I call a reporting database. So these are my words, not necessarily a vendor or anybody else's words for that matter. Just a way of classifying it.
And let me just add in, I think that philosophically and in terms of meeting our needs here in Iowa, that we didn't want a case management database. You know, it comes out of our work and the idea that the knowledge or the decisions about what's best for a survivor are determined by that survivor, and they are not determined by which boxes are available for checking in a database. And so we wanted a database that keeps the survivor at the center of the conversation and is focused on what he or she can do for themselves, and not driven by what's provided in a database.
One of our goals with this kind of was an unwritten thing, but it was said several times, was we wanted to keep the technology from getting in the way of advocacy. We don't want the database, if you will, to get in the way between, or a mandatory thing, if you will, between an advocate and the survivor. We don't want that to happen. So we tried to, and maybe that's why I use the terms reporting versus case the way I do. We want it to be something that they typed in after the fact, after they helped this person, and that person's been on their way, and then they could enter that information, not something they sit and fill out the blanks while that person's there.
Thank you. I'm going to scroll up in the chat box and find more questions that were not answered. Debbie, do you have anything?
I do not have anything. Is there anything else, Zeb or Scott, that you think would be useful that you would like to share? And I'll do a quick plug just so everyone knows. Sorry, Scott and Zeb. this is very important. Many states are already receiving HUD funding, but there is the new Rapid Rehousing DV bonus project that's set aside for $50 million. So this is definitely a critical point in our field as we're getting this brand new continuum of care funding that we'd love to go to victim service providers in the country. So yeah, so this is very timely in terms of if you are considering applying for those funds and working with your COC to get those funds at your victim service agency, you'll need to have a data collection, a way to collect data, a solution for that so you can do the annual progress report for the continuum of care funding. And so Scott, I'll turn it back over to you, Scott and Zeb. Anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I got a couple things, a couple questions here that came up. Our database is set to what I call pre-canned reports. They're almost every voca VAWA that you can think of, rule, stop, etc. FIPSA reports. They do our state reports that are quarterly or biannual. They do SA reports or SV, as well as survivors of victim of homicide and shelter, all the HUD stuff. So it does a plethora, here's a good word, plethora of reports pre-canned. And again, I want to make sure that people understand about this is every field that's in our database, every bit of data that's collected can be queried by our site admins to pull a custom report. We have other funders. This is a state funded, if you will, database, but we have our local agencies get funds from other places. So they can actually pull reports for Allstate or for whoever else that they have a different report that's not in the system. They can do that as well. So hopefully that answers your question. The only other closing thing, I guess, that I didn't mention before, I should have, is I had mentioned that our previous database, the one that we almost rolled out, if you will, took about 12, 14 months of development time and training and such. This one, with everything we learned and with a different vendor, took 4. And it probably should have took about 2.5. So once you got your ducks in the row, they walk pretty quick. Yep.
Well, the one thing I was going to add is really one of the successes, I think, of our process, particularly in ensuring that the voca VAWA, DV, SA, homicide, trafficking reports were in there, was because our process was really driven on the victim services end. It was victim services that put out the RFP, and we knew putting out the RFP, particularly at the coalition level, that HUD had to be a part of that. That ESG and the COC APR were essential to that, but it was mostly driven by the DV end. So in terms of getting reports that worked for, just because and Scott and I were talking about this just earlier today, the understanding what's required of the victim service report is not as sort of clear-cut as it is with HUD. There's more nuance. I think that was your word.
Nuance is good.
When it comes to completing those reports, and so it was really good that we had folks at the table that understood those nuances from the very beginning when it came to the database. And so I think that was also really helpful to us and really helpful to the programs, feeling like they could understand what was being required of them, and just the excitement that came from our local programs when they realized that not only were they getting training and support on a new database, but that they might be able to go from entering data into 3 or 4 databases. Yep. And all the security risks that come with having your data in 3 or 4 different places to having a single database, and how helpful that is not only to getting good reporting, but to deduplicating at the local agency to all of these things. The information is more accurate when it's in that single place.
And it frees up the advocates' time to go and do their actual job, which, again, was always on our radar, is to make this as seamless, if you will, as possible. The question here I tried to answer was the reports that are generated by our database now live, if you will, are going to be, as far as I know, last I looked, nearly identical to what you're going to see on the vendor's website or the demo site, the exclusion, of course, of our state ones. These are the same reports that everybody uses, so they're going to be identical. That's all I got. Anything else?
Well, we have
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, we have just a few minutes left. We can wrap up, or did you have anything else, Laura?
One question from Pamela. I think it's just a clarification. Does your version of EmpowerDB handle collection of both DV and SV services?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of our local agencies are joint agencies, so that was absolutely critical.
Thank you.
Yep.
And thank you all for your great questions, too.
Yeah, great questions.
Great question.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being so engaged in the chat box and for the lively discussion. I wanted to thank Scott and Zeb and also congratulate them on their work of launching their comparable database. For those of you on the call, you know that this is no small feat to try to organizing a statewide response for each victim service agency to be able to report to HUD and other victim service funding streams that they receive. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the webinar a couple minutes early, and so that brings us to the end of our webinar. And I want to thank you all for your patience and all the great questions that you had. On behalf of the National Network to End Domestic Violence and the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium partners at Collaborative Solutions, I'd like to thank Zeb and Scott for taking the time to share their expertise on their comparable database planning and implementation journey that still continues, and with all of us today. And I'd like to thank all of you who participated on the webinar. We will be sending out the PowerPoint from today's webinar as well, and we encourage you to listen to the recording, share the recording, and have it as a reference to share with your colleagues. And then you can also find it on the Safe Housing Partnerships website at safehousingpartnerships.org, where you will find additional resources on the intersection of DV and housing and homelessness. And thank you all for participating, and have a great day. Thank all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, guys.